Every colony in this series so far was founded by people. People escaping persecution, people chasing profit, people acting on a political conviction. New York was founded by a corporation, the Dutch West India Company, a joint stock trading corporation, sent colonists to the Hudson River Valley in the 1620s not to build a city, not to create a refuge, not to write a constitution, to trap beavers. The beaver felt hat was the luxury good of 17th century Europe, and the Hudson River Valley had more beavers than anywhere else on the continent. That is the origin story of New York City, beaver hats, and it produced the most important city in the Western world, which tells you something about the relationship between commerce and civilization that no philosophy seminar ever quite captures. Here's the scope of what New Amsterdam became before the English arrived. By 1643, 17 years after its founding, New Amsterdam had 18 languages being spoken within its small settlement at the southern tip of Manhattan. 18. The entire English colonial world at the same point had nothing remotely comparable. Jews arrived from Brazil in 1654, the first Jewish community in North America, and were grudgingly allowed to stay after the Dutch West India Company overruled Peter Stuyvesant's attempt to expel them. The city had taverns, one for every 4 or 5 adults by some estimates. It had merchants from a dozen nations. It had a wall at its northern edge built to keep out English encroachment. That wall is now Wall Street. New Amsterdam was New York before New York existed. Today we cover the full founding story of New York, from Henry Hudson's 1609 voyage up the river that bears his name, to the Dutch West India Company's establishment of New Amsterdam in 1626, to Peter Minuit's purchase of Manhattan from the Lenape, to the golden decades of Dutch colonial commerce, to Peter Stuyvesant's authoritarian rule, and his bizarre series of personal vendettas, to the bloodless English takeover of 1664, to New York's role in the Revolution, including the fact that New York City was occupied by the British for the entire Revolutionary War, and finally, to why New Amsterdam's DNA of commercial diversity, tolerance by indifference, and absolute refusal to be governed is still the defining character of New York City today. Back to the beginning. The Dutch claim to the Hudson River Valley begins with an Englishman, Henry Hudson, sailing for the Dutch East India Company in 1609, was looking for a northwest passage to Asia when he turned into what is now New York Harbor and sailed north up the river that now bears his name, reaching as far as present-day Albany. He found no passage to Asia. He found something better, a river system penetrating deep into a continent full of furs. The Dutch recognized the commercial value immediately. In 1614, the Dutch built Fort Nassau near present-day Albany as a trading post. In 1621, the Dutch West India Company was chartered specifically to manage trade in the Atlantic world. In 1624, the first permanent Dutch settlers arrived in the Hudson Valley. In 1626, Peter Minuit arrived as Director General and made the purchase that everyone knows and almost nobody understands correctly. In 1626, Peter Minuit, the Dutch West India Company's Director General, negotiated a purchase of Manhattan Island from the Lenape people for trade goods valued at approximately 60 guilders. This is one of the most misrepresented transactions in American history. It was not a swindle. The Lenape understood trade perfectly well. They had been trading with Europeans for decades. The misunderstanding, if there was one, was likely conceptual rather than financial. The Lenape concept of land use did not include permanent individual ownership in the European sense. They may have understood the agreement as a shared use arrangement rather than an absolute sale. The Dutch understood it as a purchase. That conceptual gap between European property law and Lenape land use would recur across the continent for the next 2 centuries. But in 1626, both parties believed they had made an agreement. The Dutch began building. New Amsterdam grew at the southern tip of Manhattan Island through the 1630s and 1640s into a genuinely remarkable settlement, unlike anything else in colonial America. Its street layout was organic, not planned. The paths of cows going to pasture became the streets of Lower Manhattan, which is why Lower Manhattan's street grid is still the most chaotic in the city today. A wall was built across the island's northern edge in the 1640s to protect against English encroachment from Connecticut. That wall ran along what is now Wall Street. The Dutch introduced the concept of vrijheid, freedom, in their commercial dealings. You could trade with anyone, worship as you chose privately, and the company mostly left you alone as long as commerce flowed. It was tolerance born of commercial indifference rather than conviction, but it worked. In September 1654, 23 Jewish refugees arrived in New Amsterdam aboard the French privateer vessel Saint Catherine, having fled the fall of Dutch Brazil to the Portuguese Inquisition. They arrived with essentially nothing. Their possessions had been seized to pay their passage. Peter Stuyvesant, the Director General, immediately petitioned the Dutch West India Company to expel them. His letter described them in terms that were the common anti-Semitic language of the era. The company's response was decisive: no. The Amsterdam Jewish community had invested significantly in the Dutch West India Company. The Jews of New Amsterdam would be allowed to remain, to trade, and eventually to own property. The first Jewish community in North American history was established not by a tolerance charter, but by a corporate board's commercial calculation. Asser Levy subsequently fought for and won the right of Jewish men to stand watch and serve in the city's militia. Equal civic participation in 1657. Peter Stuyvesant is the most entertaining figure in this entire series, and I mean that as a specific kind of compliment. He was brilliant, courageous, deeply devout, completely authoritarian, and possessed of a gift for making enemies that bordered on the supernatural. He governed New Amsterdam from 1647 to 1664 with an iron peg leg. He had lost his right leg to a cannonball in a previous Dutch colonial posting and wore a silver-banded wooden prosthetic that became his most recognizable feature. He expelled, or attempted to expel, Quakers, Jews, Lutherans, and Catholics from New Amsterdam, and was overruled by the Dutch West India Company every time. He taxed the colonists heavily, jailed people who complained, and publicly dismissed the idea of representative government as dangerous democracy. He was also an exceptionally effective administrator who turned New Amsterdam from a chaotic trading post into a functioning city. He was wrong about everything important and right about everything operational. New York has been producing this exact type of person in positions of authority ever since. In 1657, Stuyvesant banned Quaker worship in New Amsterdam and had Quakers arrested for the crime of holding religious meetings. In response, a group of non-Quaker English residents of the town of Flushing, in what is now Queens, wrote and signed a petition protesting the ban. The Flushing Remonstrance is one of the most important documents in American religious freedom history, and almost nobody has heard of it. It argued, in 1657, that freedom of conscience was a natural human right, that the magistrates had no authority over private religious belief, and that all people, regardless of faith, specifically including Jews, Turks, and Egyptians, deserved protection from government religious persecution. It went further than the Maryland Toleration Act. It went almost as far as Roger Williams. It was written in Queens, in 1657, by people who weren't even Quakers, defending people whose faith they didn't share. Let's be precise about what the Dutch built in New Amsterdam that survived the English takeover. 1. The street layout of Lower Manhattan. Those organic, non-grid streets that make Lower Manhattan navigationally insane today are Dutch cowpaths. 2. The commercial culture. New York's identity as a city where what you can do matters more than who you are or what you believe is Dutch in origin. 3. The diversity. 18 languages in 1643 set a cultural template that New York has maintained for nearly 400 years. 4. Specific place names. Brooklyn is Brooklyn. Harlem is Harlem. The Bronx is from the Bronx family farm. Staten Island from Staten Island. Wall Street from the Dutch Wall. 5. The legal concept of a deed. Dutch colonial property law introduced recorded deeds to North American real estate. The English renamed the city. They could not rename what it already was. Before we get into the English takeover of 1664 and what happened when they tried to impose order on a city that had never accepted it, comment below. 7 episodes in, we've now covered Virginia, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, and New York. I want to know, which of these founding stories most changed how you think about America? Not which is most dramatic. Which one actually shifted something in how you understand the country? Tell me below. I read every reply. In August 1664, an English fleet of 4 warships arrived in New Amsterdam harbor under the command of Colonel Richard Nicolls, bearing a commission from King Charles II's brother, the Duke of York, the future King James II, to seize the Dutch colony. Peter Stuyvesant wanted to fight. He stood on the fort's walls looking at 4 English warships and reportedly said he would rather be carried out dead than surrender. His own colonists, Dutch merchants, English settlers, and the general population of New Amsterdam sent him a petition with 93 signatures asking him not to. They had warehouses full of goods, families, and a functioning city. They had no particular attachment to Dutch sovereignty. Stuyvesant reportedly wept, tore the English letter into pieces, had his soldiers reassemble it so it could be read, and surrendered. Not a single shot was fired. The Dutch colony of New Amsterdam became the English colony of New York in one afternoon. The Duke of York, now the proprietor of New York, governed through his appointed governor, Richard Nicolls, with a legal code called the Duke's Laws. The transition was, by colonial standards, remarkably smooth. The Dutch were allowed to keep their property, their language, their church, and their commercial practices. The Duke's laws were more autocratic than the Dutch system in some ways. There was no elected assembly, but Nicolls was an effective and relatively enlightened administrator who understood that the city functioned because its inhabitants were left largely to their own commercial devices. The English added English, but New York's character remained Dutch. The streets stayed crooked, the taverns stayed open, and the diversity of 18 languages contracted only slightly. The city absorbed the English the same way it absorbs everything, by continuing to be exactly itself. New York's colonial political history is the most chaotic in the series, and I want to give you the Leicester Rebellion specifically because it encapsulates everything about New York's relationship with authority. In 1689, the same year as Maryland's Protestant Revolution, Jacob Leisler, a German-born merchant, seized control of New York's Fort James during the political vacuum created by England's Glorious Revolution. He held it for 2 years, claiming to govern in the name of the new Protestant monarchs, William and Mary. When the actual royal governor arrived in 1691, Leisler refused to hand over the fort until he received the order directly in writing. He was arrested for treason, tried, convicted, beheaded, and disemboweled on the tip of Manhattan. New York then spent the next 2 decades bitterly divided between Leislerians and anti-Leislerians. A man was executed for holding a fort in the name of the people he was eventually surrendering to. This is New York. New York's history of slavery requires the same honest accounting we've given to every other colony in this series. The Dutch West India Company brought enslaved Africans to New Amsterdam as early as 1626, the same year as the Manhattan Purchase. By the time of the English takeover in 1664, Enslaved Africans constituted a significant portion of New Amsterdam's population. Some estimates suggest 20%. Under English rule, the slave trade expanded significantly. The Royal African Company had a monopoly on the English slave trade, and New York became a major receiving port. By 1700, New York City had the largest enslaved population of any city in the northern colonies. The diversity and commercial vitality of New Amsterdam and New York was built, in substantial part, on enslaved labor. The 18 languages included the languages of enslaved Africans who had no choice about being there. New York's Revolutionary War story is the most complicated in the series because New York City was occupied by the British for the entire war. After the disastrous Battle of Long Island in August 1776, where the Maryland 400 we met in Episode 6 sacrificed themselves to save Washington's army, Washington's forces retreated from Brooklyn to Manhattan, and then off Manhattan entirely, and the British occupied New York City from September 1776 to November 1783, 7 years. The city became the British headquarters for the entire North American War. It was also the largest Loyalist stronghold in America. New York had a substantial population of Loyalists who genuinely did not want independence. When the British finally evacuated in November 1783, thousands of Loyalists sailed with them to Nova Scotia and England rather than remain in the new republic. New York's greatest individual contribution to the founding generation was a man who wasn't even American by birth. Alexander Hamilton arrived in New York from the Caribbean island of Nevis in 1773, at approximately 18 years old, an orphan of illegitimate birth with no money and no connections, and within a decade had become Washington's chief aide-de-camp, one of the most important battlefield commanders in the Revolution, the primary author of the Federalist Papers, the first Secretary of the Treasury, and the architect of the American financial system. Hamilton is the most purely New York figure in the entire founding generation, an immigrant with nothing who became everything through sheer commercial and intellectual force. He didn't have the family, the land, or the colonial lineage. He had the argument. In New York, that was enough. New York's list of firsts that nobody teaches. First Jewish community in North America, New Amsterdam, 1654. First document to argue freedom of conscience applies to all people, regardless of faith. The Flushing Remonstrance, Queens, 1657. First capital of the United States, New York City, 1789 and 1790. Washington was inaugurated here. First Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, New York. First American Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, founded under the buttonwood tree on Wall Street in 1792, on the line of the Dutch Wall. First organized police force in America, New York City, 1845. First pizza in America, New York City, 1905. I am including this. First subway, New York City, 1904. The colony founded by a corporation to trap beavers became the financial, cultural, and gastronomic capital of the Western world. The beaver had earned its money back. Like Rhode Island, New York was a reluctant constitutional ratifier. New York ratified the Constitution on July 26, 1788, by a margin of just 3 votes, 30 to 27. And only after 10 other states had already ratified and the new government was effectively underway. New York's objection was structural. Anti-federalists, led by Governor George Clinton, argued that a strong central government threatened the commercial and political autonomy that New York's economy depended on. Alexander Hamilton, in the most extraordinary act of constitutional advocacy in American history, co-wrote all 85 of the Federalist Papers arguing for ratification, most of them while also managing his law practice. New York ratified. The city that had resisted every form of governance since Peter Stuyvesant accepted the Constitution because Hamilton made the argument too good to refuse. It was the most New York possible outcome. The Hudson River Valley is one of the most spectacular landscapes in North America, and the reason it appears in this series is that it shaped everything. The river is navigable deep into the continent. The Palisades on its western bank are among the most dramatic geological formations on the eastern seaboard. The valley's autumn colors, the golds and reds of the maple and oak forests that Hudson saw in 1609, and that the Dutch painters of the Hudson River School would celebrate 2 centuries later, are among the most beautiful in the world. The geography made New Amsterdam possible and New York inevitable. A river that connects the interior of a continent to the Atlantic Ocean will always be the site of the most important city on that continent's eastern coast. Henry Hudson found it in 1609. The rest is exactly as complicated as you would expect. Here's the insight I want to leave you with about New York. Every other colony in this series was founded on a principle: survival, religious purity, political freedom, tolerance, commerce with a charter. New York was founded on a transaction, and what that transaction produced, accidentally, commercially, without any founding document or philosophical charter, was the closest thing colonial America had to a genuinely open society. Not because anyone planned it, because trade requires participation, and participation requires tolerance of the person you're trading with, and tolerance of the person you're trading with, practiced consistently across 18 languages and a dozen faiths, produces something that looks remarkably like a free society. The Flushing Remonstrance put it into words in 1657, but New Amsterdam had been living it since 1626. Commerce got there first. It usually does. Peter Stuyvesant, who spent 17 years trying to make New Amsterdam conform to his authoritarian, religiously exclusive vision, was overruled by his own colonists, his own company, and eventually by 4 English warships whose arrival he could not prevent. He retired to his farm on the Bowery, the Dutch word for farm, and lived there until his death in 1672. The farm became the Stuyvesant neighborhood of Manhattan. The street is still Stuyvesant Street. The man who tried to expel the Jews, the Quakers, the Lutherans, and the Catholics ended up buried in a chapel on his farm in the city that kept all of them. The Flushing Remonstrance he tried to suppress is now displayed in the New York State Archives as one of the foundational documents of American religious freedom. New York did what New York always does. It outlasted him. It outlasts everyone. That's New York, episode 7 of 13. Next up is Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania's founding story is in some ways the most complete answer to everything this series has been building toward. Because William Penn was a Quaker, and the Quakers had been flogged in Massachusetts, expelled from New Amsterdam by Stuyvesant, and barely tolerated everywhere else in the colonies. Penn went to King Charles II with a royal debt the crown owed his father and said, "Pay me in land." He got Pennsylvania. And what he built on that land was the most deliberately, comprehensively tolerant colony in American history. Tolerant not just of Christians, not just of white Europeans, but of everyone. Penn negotiated with the Lenape rather than conquering them. He built Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, as the most planned and most idealistic urban design in colonial America. It worked. For a while. That's episode 8. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you there.